My name is Beth Wasden. I'm the Volunteer and Outreach Coordinator at the Nanticoke Watershed Alliance. And again, welcome to Native Trees for the Birds and the Bees and the Seas. First of all, I realize that many of you are familiar with the Nanticoke Watershed Alliance, but just very briefly, I do want to describe who we are and what we do. We foster partnership and progress in conserving the natural, cultural, and recreational resources of the Nanticoke River watershed through dialogue, collaborative outreach, and education. We have several major programs. Some of them vary from year to year according to the funding that we have at the time, but our perennial powerhouse is our Nanticoke Creek Watchers volunteer water monitoring program. We also have a Nanticoke River Grass Watchers program that just began, and we actually held training last Saturday. We recorded the training. We are still looking for volunteers to assist in that program. Unlike Creek Watchers, it's a lot looser. You could go out once, you could go out 100 times, that's up to you. If you're interested, you can sign up for on-demand training at nanticokeriver.org/SAV2020. Another major program that we are working on this year is doing what we're doing tonight. This is considered a homeowner workshop, and we do work with a lot of residents of the Nanticoke River watershed. We also have a faith-based planting program that is also going on in the state of Delaware. With partner organization Ridges to Reefs, we recently put in a bioreactor down in Dorchester County in a field. That's something new for us, so that's our first bioreactor project, and basically that filters runoff from the field and greatly reduces, in particular, the nitrates that are coming off the field. We also have a really cool poultry house pollinator plot project that's going on where we're going to be putting in pollinator plots in between poultry houses at a poultry farm in Sussex County. We also have a website called Paddle the Nanticoke that really supports recreational use of the Nanticoke River and also neighboring Fishing Bay watershed. So if you're ever looking for a public access spot to launch your kayak, canoe, or boat, that's a great website to check out. And of course, we're doing what we're doing tonight. This is our native planting series. As most of you probably know, we have a series of 4 workshops this month. Sydney and I are actually going to be alternating. So I'm handling duties tonight. Sydney is going to be hosting Pots for Pollinators next Thursday. And then after that, I will be hosting Beautiful Homes on Saturday, July 18th. And Sydney's going to wrap things up with Planting for the Future on July 28th. So we are still accepting registration. So if you know anyone who would be interested in attending these workshops, please feel free to share the registration link, nanticokeriver.org/native-series. So now we're going to get into the actual meat of our presentation, and we're going to start talking about trees. And before we do that, of course, we want to discuss what a native plant is. Some people aren't aware that some plants and trees are considered to be native and some are exotic. So first of all, a native plant is one that belonged in this area prior to European colonization. Native plants are really cool because they are adapted to this area's wacky climate and conditions. So they can go from all the rain to none of the rain, and they'll actually manage to continue doing what they do, growing, flowering, supporting our native fauna. They're gonna do that regardless of the weather conditions. And they're very important because they co-evolved with our native fauna. So a lot of our insects in particular are dependent on certain types of plants. So that is very crucial. Some insects, they can't even survive without particular host plants. Native plants also provide a number of benefits that non-natives just can't do. And we'll be looking at those benefits as we continue the presentation tonight. So what's an invasive plant? So first of all, you may have heard the term invasive. Some people use it a little bit more loosely than it should be. A native plant, for example, could be very aggressive, but they're not invasive. Invasive exclusively refers to exotic plants, so plants that do not belong here and weren't here when Europeans colonized the area. These aggressive exotic plants are able to outcompete native plants. Many of them, for example, they'll have leaves earlier and later than our native plants. And that's a good indicator that, hey, this might not belong here. Unfortunately, they provide very few to absolutely no ecological benefits. So unlike our natives, which are tied to our fauna, these invasive plants are not. And then they end up displacing native plants that our fauna do need in order to survive. That also, of course, impacts our songbirds because many of them are dependent on native insects for food for themselves and for their young every spring. Unfortunately, invasive plants also remain available at many nurseries, so you can still go into a lot of different greenhouses and pick up an invasive. I do want to say that not all non-native plants are invasive, right? There are some really cool non-native plants. Just because the plant isn't from pre-colonial days in the US, it could still be a benefit in your landscape. So you shouldn't just go out and rip out something that isn't native, but if it's invasive, it should be something that you look to remove. One of the files that I shared with Sydney is an invasive plant guide, a PDF, so that you can actually look and see what some of the invasive plants in the area are, and she's going to share that in the chat box. So going back to natives now, because that's why we're here tonight. These are some of our rock star native plants. And if any of you are familiar with Doug Tallamy, who is a professor at University of Delaware, he has written a series of books, including Bringing Nature Home, which is a really great resource. And if you're looking for planting lists and this type of information, highly recommend Bringing Nature Home as a resource for you to bring into your home. So it has really good information, including, hey, these are our rock star plants and trees. So I did include a couple of herbaceous plants at the bottom, asters and Joe Pye, just to show as plants, these are the number of butterfly and moth species that are supported, but you can see that the oaks are major rock stars, and they actually support over 500 different butterfly and moth species. So if you can put in a beautiful oak tree and support that at your house, you're doing a lot of good. You're actually supporting a wide number of butterfly and moth species. Following that, you have cherry and then willow, and they're both very close, just around 450. And then pine, and I think a lot of times pine trees kind of get a bad rap. You know, people get irritated by pine straw or the pine cones, but I would actually say pine straw makes a wonderful mulch, and you should keep that in mind as a potential resource. Next, hickory trees support about 200 of those butterfly and moth species, and also blueberries. And I know blueberries, I have a lot of them in my own landscape. They're very, very popular with pollinators. They're fabulous specimen to have in your landscape. And you can plant several. And because they are so small, they're very easy to fit in as they're a shrub. Lastly, you have maple, which is around that 280, very similar to blueberry as well. So this photo is by Doug Tallamy, and of course I had to borrow it just because it's so cool, because who doesn't love a chickadee? And so the chickadee has a nice juicy caterpillar that the chickadee can feed to its little ones in the nest. The flyer on the right-hand side, I just really liked because it has a lot of information in a small area, and that's always really cool. So chickadees, for example, in order for them to raise one nest, and usually, you know, chickadees are going to raise 2 or 3 different nests, or they're going to have 2 or 3 broods per year. They have to forage up to 9,000 caterpillars in order to feed those babies and to have those babies fledge. So in order for you to have caterpillars in your landscape, you need native plants in order to attract them. So again, you can see some really cool numbers here. Native oaks support 500 plus butterfly and moth species, and then it runs down all the way. If we compare non-native boxwood, forsythia, and butterfly bush, they support 1 butterfly and moth species. Non-native daylilies, hostas, and lily turf support 0. So that's just something to keep in mind when you do make your landscape choices. So, you know, a lot of people have daylilies and hostas, for example, and they're not necessarily awful things, but it's just you need to balance out your landscape. And Tallamy, based on research that he has done in suburban Washington, D.C. areas, has really determined that your landscape needs to be about 70% native in order to support a healthy ecology and support the local wildlife. So anything less than that, and bird species are not going to be able to reproduce at normal rates in your landscape. So I like to start with birds because most of us are really, we love birds. And like I said, hey, it's a chickadee. Who doesn't like a chickadee? But near and dear to my heart are bees. And I do want to talk about bees because they are overlooked a lot. They're certainly getting a lot more press. But even when people think about bees, often they think about honeybees. And honeybees are like a lot of, well, they're non-native. So they're like these non-native plants that came over. Honeybees also came over with European colonists back in the 1600s. They are not native to North America or the United States. We do have some fabulous native bees, however. We have about 400 in Maryland and in Delaware. And a lot of them are overlooked, and you may not even know that they're bees. But we have bees basically from the point when, you know, it gets to be 50 degrees during the day until, say, October, November, when we get our first frost. The early foraging native bees I'm concentrating on right now because I only have so many food or potential food sources at that time. The red maple is one of those primary food sources. So those flowers, and they're usually high up in the tree canopy, so you're not even seeing this activity, but those flowers high up in the tree canopy are supporting a lot of early foraging native bees that come out early. So the bumblebee queen, when she comes out, as soon as the temperature is 50, she needs food. She's the only one there. So she needs to be able to find food, and she needs to be able to provision cells and grow new bees who can act as workers for her so that she can remain in the nest the remainder of the time. She's lucky. The rest of our native bees, they're either solitary, completely solitary, or they're eusocial. So you may have daughters nesting near each other, and maybe they're working together somewhat, but it's certainly not a shared nesting situation. So they're on their own. And some of these bees are very specific. They have very specific needs. They're specialists. So they're looking for specific host plants. Others, like bumblebees, are generalists, and they can they can forage a variety of different plant sources, which is great. We don't have a lot of specific data about our native solitary bees, or even, bumblebees, which most people are familiar with. In general, though, you've probably heard about it because it has made the news. Bees are broadly declining along with many other insects. So it is something to be concerned about, because our fate is tied to the fate of insects. We really depend on them, and they depend on us. Native bees, if you like to eat, I know I like to eat. I have, I think about my raspberries. I've had a great raspberry year. Native bees made that happen. They were out there busy pollinating back in May, making sure that I was going to have a wonderful raspberry harvest. But they pollinate about 3/4 of our fruits and vegetables, and also about 80% of flowering plants. Most native bees, they're docile. They're, like I said, solitary. They don't have a nest to protect. They're on their own. They live about 6 weeks, so they're really not worried about you at all. They don't want to sting you. They just want to go out and do what they need to do in order to provide for the next generation. So please don't fear them. You want to provide for them. Make sure that they have a home in your landscape. And by choosing the right plants and trees, you can certainly do that. So whatever you plant this year, if you are doing some planting this year, you might not be able to support them now or even in the spring, but choosing trees and shrubs that are going to provide food and habitat for bees in the future is definitely the way to go. So I created a little, these next couple of slides are going to show some trees and shrubs that are for the bees, but also for sources that act as butterfly hosts. It's a good source for birds. You got the little bird symbol. Pollinator magnet just means it's a super pollinator magnet. So you have a magnet, right? And then a baby leafcutter bee nursery material tree. There's only one of those listed, but I will tell you, in my landscape, the leafcutters love my muscadine grapevines. I've also seen them use maple leaves. Really, they seem to be able to adapt and use a lot of different types of leaves. If you see that perfect circle in one of your leaves, it's just an absolute perfect circle. That means that you have leafcutter bees in your yard nesting, and that's awesome. It's awesome also to watch them actually cut those holes. They use their mandibles to just chew a perfect circle, and then they tuck it and they fly off with it, so that they can go ahead and start a new cell for the next generation. So these are all early spring flowering. We're going to start with trees, but we also have shrubs coming up. If you don't have as much space, shrubs are a great option. First of all, the red maple, which I mentioned, it's a great early flowering tree. It supports butterflies, birds, and bees. The tulip poplar, which is gorgeous. Most people are aware of that tree. It supports butterflies and bees. Black cherry, which is always, which I already mentioned, broadly when we're talking cherry trees and the number of butterflies it supports. You can see the butterfly is really large because it supports a wide number of butterflies and moths, also bees and birds, and it is a pollinator magnet. So if you're looking for something that is just going to draw in and support a number of pollinators, it's a good choice. Some of our early spring flowering shrubs, the serviceberry or shad bush, which supports butterflies, bees, and birds. The beautiful eastern redbud supports butterflies and bees. It also is a popular plant material for leafcutter bees, and it is a pollinator magnet. The wild plum is a great supporter of butterflies and bees, and the pussy willow is a great supporter of butterflies, bees, and our songbirds. And then another add-on for shrubs, the sweet crabapple is a good support of bees and birds, and the high bush blueberry, and really any of the blueberries, low bush, the deerberry. There are so many vaccinium species that are excellent support for a wide range of wildlife, but a good support for butterfly, bees, and birds. And if you are wondering about perennials, we will be talking about perennials in particular during the Beautiful Homes program on July 18th. A lot of the information that I pulled for these slides was taken from Bees, an identification and foraging guide by Heather Holm, and also from Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home book. But particularly Heather Holm's book has a lot of great information about bees and some of their host plants and just general trees and perennials that support bees. So native trees are also clean power or clean water powerhouses. So they provide a lot of functions beyond just providing habitat for our native fauna. They also are huge nutrient uptakers. So they are using up nitrogen and phosphorus, and they're preventing it from entering waterways. The Nanticoke River has high nitrogen amounts throughout most of the watershed. So any way that we can reduce the amount of nitrogen that gets into the waterways, it's a good thing. They also prevent sediment from entering waterways by holding the soil in place. They have very deep, broad roots, and they're able to hold a lot of soil in place, and that reduces runoff. They also reduce flooding, and once they are established, they can resist drought very well. I have never watered native trees once they're established during any sort of dry weather conditions, including the ones that we've been having since late May. Another positive is they can cool surrounding areas. So a lot of times you will see a tree buffer along a waterway. It's a good thing. It's able to cool the water. That's better for dissolved oxygen, provides good fish habitat, for example. Shade also, of course, blocks sunlight, which can prevent algal blooms from occurring. We do have, again, problems with algal blooms, and in some locations with some of the harmful algal blooms, like the cyanobacteria blooms, that can actually cause negative health impacts for humans and for pets. So trees, like I said, a great clean water powerhouse. As an example from AmericanForest.org, a 100-foot tall tree can take 11,000 gallons of water from the soil and release it into the air again as oxygen and water vapor. So they're also providing us with oxygen. And of course, we need trees and plants in order for us to have oxygen and to breathe. Some additional reasons why native trees rule. If we look specifically at evergreens, they can reduce wind speed and loss of heat from your winter home from anywhere from 10 to 50%. So of course they make a great windbreak, and a lot of people do plant evergreens for that reason. The American Forestry Association estimates that 100 million new trees would absorb 18 million tons of carbon dioxide and cut US air conditioning costs by $4 billion annually. Trees, if you are a gardener, they are valuable because they can lengthen your growing season. My garden is basically walled in with trees, walls of trees on each side. And there have been times in the mid to late autumn where neighboring fields have frost, but my garden doesn't get frost. And that's because of those trees holding heat longer overnight than those fields can out in open areas. Trees can also increase your property value by 5 to 15% higher than non-landscape homes. And they are also quicker to resell than treeless homes. A great thing, depending on where you are, but a tree buffer that's 100 feet wide, 45 feet high, can reduce highway noise by half. And of course, they add beauty, winter interest, and food, nuts and fruit, to your landscape. And these statistics are courtesy of NC State Cooperative Extension. So, no hassle natives, yet another reason. They're perfect for the lazy gardener. And who doesn't want to be the lazy gardener? We always have tons of things to do, so whenever we can abdicate and not have to do something, that is a wonderful thing. So they allow you to save time and money. When you're planting a native tree, you do not want to amend the soil in any way. You just want to use the native soil that is provided, because they need to toughen up. They need to get used to the conditions that are at that location. You don't want to use fertilizer with natives. And please do not use chemicals such as insecticides on natives. That is going to impact, of course, insects, and in turn, that is going to impact your songbird population as well. If you want to save even more money, you could remove some of your unnecessary lawn and you could plant trees there instead. So when you are planting trees, here are some tips. You want to dig 2 times wider than the pot size, and you should always dig wider than deeper. If the pot looks like this example on the right-hand side, that's root bound or pot bound, and you want to make sure that you break up those roots. So if you have roots circling, that's a problem. Make sure that you loosen those up before you actually plant in the ground. If you get a large balled and burlap tree, of course it comes in the burlap and it has different hardware that's attached to it. You want to make sure that you remove all of that before you actually put it in the ground, because that hardware is going to cause problems and it could kill the tree over time. Again, you want to use the native soil that you dug out in the planting hole. Don't use amendments in the actual soil that the tree is going to be planted in. What you can do is you can top dress with some great compost that you either made or that you purchased, or you can use leaf litter, which is a great natural mulch. And you want to put a couple of inches of compost. You want to make sure that you water slowly and deeply. So it's not about how fast can I water, it should be how slow can I water. So you want to make sure that you just slowly allow that area to, basically you're just going to drip. Just let water drip in that area for about 24 hours, 12 to 24 hours, and just make sure that it gets overly saturated, and it should be good. Here are some resources on tips for planting trees. Some of them have videos, some of them are just text. 5 key steps for planting trees on the Joe Gardner website. Proper planting of trees and shrubs add a way to garden, and everything you know about tree planting is wrong, and that's at wtop.com. If you don't catch some of these links during the presentation, I will be sending up a follow-up email that will include all of the resources that are provided tonight. So please don't get frantic and, you know, try to feel like you need to grab everything right now. Some other tips: only water the first 2 years as needed. And so if you're getting a good amount of rain or you're getting too much rain, you definitely don't want to water. So if you don't have a rain gauge, which is very simple and not very expensive, I would recommend that you get one and you track how much rain you received. Next, like I said, you want to mulch, but please do not engage in mulch volcano, as this example is. This is awful, and that's definitely going to kill that tree. You never want whatever you use for mulch to touch the trunk of your tree. Make sure it has breathing room. So never do what you often see out in public. Just don't do that to your trees. So some of you may know there are two categories, major categories of trees, are deciduous trees and our evergreen trees. So deciduous trees are great for providing us cooling in the summer. They allow sunlight in and warmth in winter because they lose all of their leaves in the autumn. And those leaves, depending on where they are, you can shred them and use as compost or leaf litter mulch. Or you certainly want to leave some of them in designated areas on your property, if at all possible, so that different insects can overwinter in them. Lightning bug larvae overwinter in leaves, but so do a lot of butterfly, moth pupae. They also use leaves. So you want to make sure that you have some leaves if you want to provide good habitat for our native insects. Evergreen trees, they are perfect for being those year-round windbreaks. They provide great natural privacy fencing, and they also shed their leaves or needles, but they always have foliage. And like I said, pine straw is a great source of mulch, very usable. So you should look at that as a resource and not as a negative. In addition, we have shrubs, and most of the time our shrubs tend to be our understory plants. So they're a lot smaller than our big hardwood trees. So they're not going to be anywhere near the size of an oak, which is great if you have smaller spaces. Also, many shrubs will tolerate partial sun. Some of them even tolerate shade because they are primarily understory trees. So that's great if you don't have a lot of sunlight in your landscape, but you want to fit in a shrub or two. They are perfect for that. You can plant shrubs because of their natural use as understory with those larger hardwood trees or pine trees, or you can just plant them standalone. Many of them provide multiple functions in the landscape. The next couple of slides, I put together some different trees or shrubs that can fit some common needs that I hear, well, back in the day where you could actually talk to people in person and have outreach events. So these were some of the common things that would come up. Windbreak / privacy fence is one of the most popular. And we do have some suitable evergreens to take on either or both of these roles. Eastern red cedar is very popular, especially if the soil conditions are awful and in fields where, it's going to have to take the brunt of all the wind sweeping across hundreds or thousands of acres of cropland, so it's wide open. That red cedar is the tree for you. Also keep in mind that over 50 birds eat the tree's berries, so it's also a food source for a number of birds. American holly is, Delaware state tree. There used to be a huge natural wreath industry in Sussex County. My property, I know, it has a lot of hollies, and it's a very useful tree. It does need moist areas, so you can't just put it out in a field like you can a red cedar. It is not going to be happy there. It needs somewhere that's a little bit more Sussex County swampy. So just keep that in mind. It will grow in any light condition, although if it's more shaded, then it's going to be smaller. Loblolly pine, or really any of our native pines, are something to consider. Again, I think a lot of people aren't extremely fond of loblollies or other pines, but I encourage you to try to think about them in a different way. They actually provide a lot of value to our wildlife. They provide great cover in the winter, which our deciduous trees cannot. They also provide food for wildlife. And again, pine straw makes great mulch. So that's a resource for you as well. Sweet Bay magnolia, many people are familiar with it, but it's much smaller if you're familiar with the southern magnolia. That is a huge tree. Sweet Bay is much smaller. It is like American holly in that it prefers a moister area, so don't put it somewhere like on a field edge like you would cedar. It is tolerant of some salt, so depending on where you live, if you're in a tidal area that is brackish, if it's a small amount of salt, it should be able to handle it for short periods of time, and it will grow in any light condition. But again, the size, the blooms, that sort of thing might be impacted by heavy shade. Lastly, southern bayberry, and depending on your specific microclimate, it may not be evergreen. It may actually lose its leaves, but it's kind of cool in that it can be used as a hedge. It'll thick it up a lot of times, and you can use it as a hedge. It doesn't get any taller than 12 feet, so it's a fairly compact shrub. Next, another popular category is wet areas. You know, here on Delmarva, we have a lot of, you know, swampy areas, wet areas. So this is a question that comes up a lot. So first of all, the black gum, also known as tupelo, is a beautiful tree. It has very high wildlife value. It can actually grow where it's saturated in water. But again, under those conditions, it'll be a smaller specimen than some that have slightly drier feet. Next, the American sycamore. Depending on where you're driving around, you can see them lining some of the roads, such as Route 9 or Route 24 heading towards Sharptown is a good example, like between Laurel and Sharptown. In general, though, they prefer wetter soils, even though some of those trees are gorgeous. And if you've seen a sycamore, they're one of my favorite trees. I think their bark is just absolutely beautiful. So that is something, that texture, if you're looking for something like that, that could be something to take into consideration when you're looking at trees, is the actual texture. Lastly, bald cypress. If you've ever been to Trap Pond State Park, which is outside of Laurel, you're probably familiar with bald cypress. They're very famous for their knees, and they also lose their needles. They're deciduous. They're actually in their northernmost natural native range in southern Delaware. So this is a great spot to grow bald cypress if you have a nice wet area. This one I call for the kitchen garden. These are all different native trees that serve the purpose of providing food for us, which I think is pretty cool. First of all, spice bush, which is a medium-sized shrub. You can use it in the understory, or you can use it standalone. Black huckleberry, which is very similar to a blueberry. It's a small shrub, and it wants to be in a shady or a partially shady area. So if you have a full sun spot, you probably want to just plant a regular blueberry there instead. Beach plums, those of you who have been over, say, to Cape Henlopen, State Park over in Lewis. You've probably seen all the beach plums that they have growing there. But really, beach plums, if you got a nice sandy spot, they're going to be happy. They don't care that they're at the beach or not. They produce delicious plums. You can use those to make preserves, jams, that sort of thing. They are salt tolerant. So again, if you're in a tidal area, there's something to consider. And they're, you know, small to medium size. They're fairly compact shrubs, so they don't take up a lot of space. Next, we have the common persimmon, which is a medium-sized tree, and you can see those here and there. They usually ripen in September, October. They usually like to have a little bit of frost, but it depends on where they're at. Whether you like them or not is a matter of taste. So just keep that in mind. Certainly worth trying before buying. Next, sassafras. So if you're a fan of Louisiana cuisine, then you are probably familiar with filet. And of course, filet is made of sassafras's dried leaves. And also sassafrasses are really cool, so they're great to have in your landscape as well. Lastly, pawpaw. And I love pawpaw, but they are definitely more finicky. They need a very moist location. So if you have a pond, or again, you live next to a waterway, that could be a good spot for a pawpaw. And the fruit has a lot of different monikers, but the one I like the best, I think, is the banana of the north. There are a lot of different specific cultivars of pawpaws, and if you're going to grow them in order to eat the fruit, I recommend that you look into the specific cultivars, because if you just get a wild pawpaw, you kind of don't know what you're getting in terms of flavor. So again, if you're growing them for fruit, you want to make sure that the flavor is going to be good. Next, we have winter interest. First of all, witch hazel, our native witch hazel. It flowers in autumn, which, you know, that's very unique. And it's, you know, it's kind of a magical thing to happen as the days are getting shorter. And most things are, you know, ceasing their flowering, or they flowered long ago. They will grow in shade or partial sun. And depending on conditions, they may retain their leaves in the winter. Next, we have the ilex genus, have a lot of berries that persist in the autumn and the winter. Holly is an ilex, but so are winterberry and inkberry. So a lot of times they will have beautiful red berries that persist until the birds find them. And then you'll just have your winter berry after that, because birds will tend to, once they find it, they'll clean it out pretty quickly. Inkberry tolerates broader light conditions, and it also tolerates some salt. So again, something to keep in mind if you live in a brackish tidal property. Lastly, northern bayberry. It again has berries that persist into winter. It colonizes areas, which is great if you have an area that you want to fill in. Not so great if you're just looking to have one specimen. So that is something to keep in mind. It will tolerate salt water up to 20 parts per thousand. So that's, you know, all the way down to the lower Nanocoke, it would be able to tolerate that water. So that is another plus. A lot of people want to know, where can I buy native plants and trees? First of all, we do have some dedicated native plant nurseries, including Atkins Arboretum. Right now they're having, I think they're about to close it to prepare for their autumn plant sale, but they have an online order, and then you arrange a specific pickup time. They will begin the ordering process for their September plant sale, which is going to be pickup only. So you're going to pre-order August and pick up in September. Environmental concern, they're also only doing order pickup. So you would need to make arrangements with that. You can't go out and browse. Sussex Conservation District has an online shop, and you can either go to their office and pick up, or they will deliver to you. They are very reasonable. And they have a pretty good selection. They may not have everything that you want, but I would encourage you, if there's something that they don't have, you should certainly inquire about it, because maybe it would be possible to get that for you. And then, of course, we have a lot of other nurseries in the area, local nurseries that are not exclusively native plant nurseries, but they do have some native plants. And those include the Inland Bays Garden Center over in Frankfort, Delaware, the East Coast Garden Center in Millsboro. It's actually closer to Oak Orchard. Jeff's Greenhouses, which is in Bethel. How Sweet It Is, which is down in Eden, Maryland, and Lakeside Nursery in Laurel. So if you are a resident of the Nanticoke River watershed, and specifically in Delaware, although if you're in Maryland and you want to do a substantial project, we would certainly want to talk to you. We do have a site visit form, and there is a doc, but at this point I would prefer you just to fill out the web version of the form. And you can do that at nanticokeriver.org/site visit. You will specify what you're interested in doing, whether it's installing a rain garden or putting in a tree planting, etc. And you would just list your contact information. And then at some point, it's probably going to be fairly soon, I would say in August, maybe later in July, we'll start doing site visits. And of course, we will be very safe. All of these are obviously going to be done outside, and we will be masked up. And we'll also social distance during the site visits. So please fill one of those out if you are interested in doing a project with us. Our projects are basically very low cost. There is a small investment, usually about 20% of the cost, that you would be responsible for. And of course, you would be responsible for maintenance of whatever the project is. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks for all of you for attending tonight. Do you have any questions? Are there any questions, Sydney?
Yes, we do have one.
Okay.
So the first one is Southern Bayberry hardy in Zone 7A?
Yes, but it may lose its leaves. It depends on where it's planted, how open it is. So that's the microclimate.